Right around the time that Cynet Codec came out, I started playing Code Talkers all the time at locals, and I started getting a lot of questions and requests on how to play the deck, specifically ones questioning how to do the combos, and I'm more than happy to show off how to use this deck. So in this video, I'm going to be giving a more in-depth look on Code Talkers. I'll start things off by showing off some of the combos that you need to know in order to use the deck. Then I'll be showing some replays, going second and showing what kind of boards this deck can break. Finally, I'll be talking about some future options for the deck. Timestamps will be in the description if you want to skip to any of these specific parts of the video. And if you want a card-by-card breakdown, I'll leave a link in the description for my most recent deck profile on this deck. In this portion of the video, I'm going to be showing 7 combos that I think are particularly important to know while playing Code Talkers. Now these combos can be done with a different variation of cards, but I'm going to be showing the combos with the least amount of cards to perform them as possible to show how easy it is to pop off in this deck with a very small amount of cards. So our first combo here is going to be demonstrating what you want to do while going first if you don't know what you're going up against. This is going to be your go-to board, and this is going to give you a Omni Negate in the form of a monster and an Omni Negate in the form of a counter trap. And you can perform this with Lady Debug and Cynet Codec. But what's particularly important about this board is your monster negate is going to be unaffected by opponent's card effects. You're going to be setting up a Tri-Gate Wizard that cannot be affected by opponent's card effects through the effect of Gachiri Attic Nister. This board is fairly easy to set up, and you can do it repeatedly and very consistently. If your opponent goes and does use Dark Ruler no more, you cannot negate it, but your Tri-Gate Wizard won't be affected by your opponent's card effects, so it doesn't matter. You let it go through, and then you just negate their cards afterwards. You're also going to be ending on a Avermax, meaning that your opponent cannot attack over your Tri-Gate Wizard anyway. Our second combo is performed with the exact same starting cards as the first combo, but instead of ending on 2 Omni Negates, you're going to end on an Extra Link and 1 Omni Negate in the form of a counter trap. Now this combo, you should only really use this if you know what you're going up against. If you know you're going up against a very Link-centric deck, something like Goki for example, this is a great board to go into to ensure that your opponent isn't going to be able to play out of it. Now, one of the most important points in this combo is the effect of Inverted Code Talker. The reason why this is important is because you need to ensure that you have a monster in hand, specifically one that Inverted Code Talker can summon whenever you use the effect of Codec to search for a light. This will let you summon the card that you search off of Inverted Code Talker. The last thing I'll recommend is after you've successfully extra-linked your opponent, go ahead and use Inverted Code Talker and Shooting Code Talker to make an Avermax so that it can't simply swing over the extra link. Our third combo is going to be a bit of a combination of the previous two. And this combo is going to be performed with Lady Debug, Cynet Codec, and Microcoder. This combo is going to end you on an Extra Link and 1 Omni Negate. But what's different than the last combo is you're also going to be giving your opponent a Nightmare Corruptor Ibli. This means that your opponent will not be able to special summon except Link monsters, but because they're extra linked, they won't be able to summon Link monsters. So, your opponent will be forced to either break your board through alternative means or attack into one of your monsters with Ibli. You will also be setting up an Avermax so that if the opponent attacks with Ibli, they will be hitting themselves for 6,000 damage because the Avermax is also going to be co-linked to a Tri-Gate Wizard. This combo is really good if you think that you're going to be going into time and you're in games 2 or 3. You're also going to have a lot of monsters on board. So on the following turn, if your opponent can't break your board completely, it'll be very easy for you to go into an Access Code Talker and easily hit the opponent for a game on the following turn. Our next combo is one that you can perform with any 2 Cyberse monsters, assuming that one is level 4 or lower. This is an easy way for you to end your boards on an Avermax in case you get interrupted or open in such a way that it is difficult to play elsewise. This next combo is one that you're probably familiar with if you've ever played Salamangreat. It's a very simple OTK that you can pull off simply by making an update jammer and using the update jammer to go into a transcode talker. you can do this entire combo off the normal summon of a Lady Debug. However, in a deck like Code Talkers, you have far more extenders, so this combo is a lot easier to pull off and you can do it far more consistently. Next up is another simple OTK that you can perform if your opponent controls a monster. This time we're going to use the effect of Code Radiator. This will turn one of our opponent's monsters to 0 and negate its effect. After that, all you need to do is make a Tri-Gate Wizard to double the damage that one of your monsters deals. If you have an additional extender, you can also go into Access Code Talker to deal over 10,000 damage in a single attack. The final of our replays is something that doesn't come up very often, but we are going to OTK our opponent through a resolved VFD by using the information that we learned from our previous 2 combos. The way that we go about doing this is by using Gachiri Adagnister. We'll make one of our monsters unaffected by opponent's card effects, and as a result, it will return to its original attribute. Assuming that it's not the attribute called by VFD, it will be able to both attack and use its effects. So, we are going to use Transcode Talker in order to OTK our opponent. It'll deal double damage and it will be able to attack twice. In the next part of this video, I want to show some replays of this deck going second, to demonstrate how you might want to play through different kinds of established boards. The first of these replays is up against Frogs. They've opened 5 back row and 2 of our cards are hand traps that aren't going to be useful here. The first thing we're going to need to do is go into Lingaribo. This card can stop trap cards, but it can't stop counter traps. So it will prevent your opponent from being able to use something like Torrential Tribute on you, but it can't stop Solemns. One really nice aspect of this deck is the fact that you play so many extenders. You're able to keep going far past when your opponent would assume that you'd need to stop, and you have so many effects that activate in grave or on field that you can easily organize chain links. This means that you can chain block effects that you think are particularly important. Access Code Talker, for example, is an easy way to chain block and your opponent cannot respond to it, so as long as you organize it as the last chain link, you'll get every effect that goes underneath it. For control matchups, I recommend comboing Gachiri Adagnister with Access Code Talker. Our next matchup is up against Abyhiss. Love the deck, hate the name. This replay demonstrates how this deck is able to play through heavy negate boards that are full of monsters, boards where you know what your opponent has in terms of the amount of negates and where they're placed. This deck can easily play around those through a combination of chain blocking and baiting out the negates. Through that, this deck isn't that afraid of Apollousa, or at least not as much as one might initially think it is. It's also noteworthy that this deck has a lot of inherent summons, which allow you to further play around cards. Now, for those of you who aren't too familiar with Abyhiss as an archetype, they have successfully set up 1 spell negate, 1 monster negate, and a field wipe for anything that wasn't special summoned from the graveyard. We can easily play around this through a combination of chain blocking and ensuring that we have either an additional summon to keep going, or a monster that was special summoned from the graveyard. If you notice throughout this entire replay, we have an additional normal summon that we hold and never actually use. Despite that, we're still going to be able to OTK our opponent. We could have played through a lot more than just that. Something else that is noteworthy is from this position, the card that we hold the entire time, Nightmare Corruptor Ibli, is a 1-card OTK, because you can normal summon it, bring back the Transcode Talker, and then go into Talkback Lancer. The final of the replays I want to show are some replays that I got while deck testing for current techs in this format. Now, some of the techs that are floating around right now are a little bit harsh against this deck. Some that come to mind immediately are Torrential Tribute, Nibiru, and Droll. Now, you can play around any of these individually, but it becomes a little harsh whenever you're going against these cards in combination. For example, you can stop your opponent from hitting you with a Nibiru by giving them a Ibli, but if they torrential your board, they're going to be able to Nibiru you again. And if your opponent drolls you, they're going to stop you from setting up a lot of your combos, but you can still OTK them. But if they torrential you, well, you can't OTK them anymore, and that becomes a bit of a problem. This is one of the biggest reasons why I decided to side a lot of back row removal. You can stop one of your opponent's back row pretty consistently with a card like Lingaribo, but if you can get rid of all of their back row, it's pretty easy to play around some hand traps that you can assume that they have, and whatever interruptions that you know they have on board. That said, one big benefit this deck does have going for it is even with cards like Droll, Torrential, and Nibiru floating around, is most people don't know how to play this deck, and even fewer people know how to play against it. All of these replays that I'm demonstrating right now are up against a good friend of mine from locals, and he's been playing against this deck for a long time. He actually knows the choke points and knows specifically where to hit it in order to ensure that it can't play. That's why I was deck testing against him in particular for the upcoming formats. Now in all of these replays, I am going second. Zoo Eldritch is a very easy matchup for this deck if you happen to be going first. I was simply choosing to go second in all of these replays in order to determine how I wanted to go about playing against the deck while going second. This deck is very customizable. You have a lot of room for different tech choices and cards that you can put in order to play against different cards that are popular within the given format. Additionally, you have a lot of room for different choices within the side, and you can take stuff out pretty easily in this deck once you know all the combos and what you need to take in and put out. There's a lot of room. You could easily fit in about 8 or 10 cards into this deck if you really need to, without really harming the deck itself. Additionally, you have access to about any Cyberse monster that has been printed or is going to be printed. You might as well be playing pure Cyberse when you're playing this deck. You have so many options. So for the last part of this video, I wanted to talk about the future of this deck, and potential options that we do have for the future. After all, this deck is missing a pretty large amount of cards, the most substantial of which are Decode Talker Heat Soul and Firewall Dragon. In fact, there's enough support missing that there's a completely different way that you can run this deck in the future, and that is as a control deck. Decode Talker Heat Soul allows the player who controls this card to pay 1,000 life points to draw a card once per turn during either player's turn. And as a result, in extremely controlling formats, or decks where you want to play a controlled deck, Code Talkers can actually play as a control deck. Down here at the bottom in the side deck, I have a wide array of options of cards that you can play if you want to use this as a control deck in the future once we get Heat Soul. But the other thing about Heat Soul is that it's also useful in the combo variant of the deck. You can easily take out Shooting Code Talker and just play Heat Soul and search different fire cards, and also just draw cards on your own turn without having to use up your own battle phase. I would argue that it's an instant takeout over Shooting Code Talker. You do lose the ability to search Radiator, but I do think it's worth it. We also obviously have Firewall Dragon. Firewall Dragon's coming back, and that's huge. It is a Link 4 that is almost completely generic. You can even make it with Scapegoat in the control version of the deck. It's very good. I'd argue that Code Talkers can probably take advantage of this card better than any other Cyberse deck, as you could easily get it co-linked to 3 monsters and bounce back 3 cards, just like you would do with Trigate Wizard to get its own negate. Beyond that, we also have some very important cards in Code Exporter. This is just like any of the other code monsters. You can use it from hand for the link summon of a Code Talker monster. And if it's used for the summon of a Code Talker monster, it lets you add back a card, meaning that you can do a lot of the boards that I demonstrated in this video. And you can end your boards grabbing a card back to ensure that you can full recover on the following turn. I'd say another really important card is Cynet Crosswhip. This is a searchable destruction quick play card for the deck simply by tributing a Cyberse monster. It's another searchable out for Mystic Mine or for other problematic cards in the format. I'd say that this card is really important. Another card coming out is Link Apple. I'm not a huge fan of this card, but it is an option because it is a Cybers monster that you can throw out on board as an extender, and you don't really have anything you have to do aside from banishing a random Link monster from your extra deck, but that can be pretty substantial in the combo variant of the deck. This might be something to think about in a more control version. The last kind of big thing coming out is Crossout Designator. If you're playing the combo version of this deck, you could use the extra room that the deck kind of has where you would normally play hand traps or forbidden droplets. Just play a couple of hand traps of different names and then play Crossout Designator to ensure that your opponent really can't stop you. The only other big things that I really want to talk about are the AI or Attic Nister cards. You can play this deck with a combination of the Attic Nister monsters. It's definitely something to think about, but the deck is a little tight on room. If you can find a good variant and a good mixture of those two engines, go for it. I'm a little hesitant because the two engines are a bit big, and I'm not sure if they'll have enough room. But overall, I'd say this deck has a lot of potential for the future. It has multiple ways that it can run. Any Cybers card that really comes out can be thrown into this deck. Ibli is a card that can just wreck an entire format if you throw it at your opponent and they're not using any Link monsters to get over it. It's a very powerful card. This deck obviously has outs to traps in the form of Lingaribo, and as I demonstrated in the video, Gachiri Attic Nister is an absolutely absurd card, basically turning any of your monsters into an Ultimate Falcon for a couple of turns. It's a very useful card. Another one to think about would be Link Spider, as you can use this card turning a Nibiru token that your opponent gives you into a Cybers monster for your turn and just kind of keep rolling. Overall, I would say that I see a lot of potential in this deck, and it honestly wouldn't surprise me if this deck turned out to be a high-tier meta threat in the future. Thanks for watching the video. Tell me in the comments section down below what you'd like to see next, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Special thanks this video goes out to Dan Gallagher, Piggin Meh, and Leland Williams.